So, the Idiot's Guide to the Boer War. This will cover pretty much everything you need to know about the course of the war itself and some of the key issues. Again, we'll get into medical technology and those sorts of things, a little bit more detail on Thursday. And the other important aspect we'll talk about is the aftermath, right? What changes does the aftermath of the Boer War drive in Britain that are important to have happened before the First World War? Does that make sense? Okay. So the lead up to the war, just a quick timeline. 1877, the Transvaal is annexed by Britain. Okay, it's annexed by Britain because it's basically about to go bankrupt. Okay, and they're facing a lot of conflict with the Zulus. They don't have any kind of organized force, so they're like, okay, Britain, take us over and help us defeat the Zulus. You remember that? We did talk about that, right? And the violent Zulu War and the Battle of Isolanda, where the Zulus basically annihilated a whole regiment of the British because they didn't have screwdrivers. 1879, Britain removes the Zulu threat. The Zulu War doesn't last that long, which of course we know it's kind of not going to because it's guns versus spears. It's not really a fair fight. 1880 to 1881 is the first Boer War. We did talk about this again. It's not particularly important except for one key issue, and that is that the Boers were able to inflict a couple of quick victories, okay, and that led to the British giving up. The reason that's a key issue is that Kruger hopes that the same tactics are going to work in the Second Boer War. Does that make sense? Why does Gladstone just gladly give it up? Yeah, there's no incentive. It's going to cost a lot of money, and there's not really anything viable for the British to get out of it. That's going to change, right? 1886, gold is discovered in the Transvaal. In 1895, Cecil Rhodes attempts to overthrow the Republic in the Jameson Raid. It's a complete fiasco and a failure. The Boers easily put it down. Okay.
Wait, what's that?
That's 1895. Who's Cecil Rhodes?
Yeah, is he the diamond guy?
He's the diamond guy, yeah.
And what happened?
He tries to organize a takeover of the Transvaal in a raid. And actually, there's some prominent British figures that were sort of linked to being involved in the planning of that, and kind of absolved of guilt later on. But in 1899, Sir Alfred Milner, who is the British High Commander in South Africa, and Kruger meet for negotiations about the Uitlander problem. Does anybody, who are the Uitlanders? Immigrants, yeah?
Scottish, weren't they? Or something
No.
like that.
Dutch.
Highlanders.
Is it Dutch?
No, it's not the Dutch. Yeah, it's the British living in the Transvaal and Orange Free State. Uitlanders is a Dutch, with a Dutch word. It's what they call the British that were living there. Okay, were they granted any rights in the Orange Free State and Transvaal? No. Okay, and that was the issue. They paid taxes, but they had no rights. Okay, just to continue that timeline, 1899, August, Britain sends reinforcements to the Cape. In October, the Boer republics demand the withdrawal of troops and that the reinforcements are sent back. And they threaten war if the British refuse to do that. Kimberley, Ladysmith, and Maeve King are all sieged. December, there's an attempt to relieve all three of those cities. All three attempts fail, and that's called Black Week. Okay? Do not get confused. Black Week is not when those three cities fall. It's when the attempts to relieve those three cities all fail, and fail pretty miserably. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a minute. Kimberley, Ladysmith, and Maeve King. I'll show them to you on a map in a minute so you can get a better idea of why they're important cities. Okay? In January, Buller's Ford suffers another defeat in January 1900 at Spion Cop. Okay. In February, Lord Roberts, that should say Roberts, not Reoberts, relieves Kimberley, and Buller finally relieves Ladysmith. Again, we'll come back to that and talk about it in more detail. In March, Roberts captures Bloemfontein, the capital of the Orange Free State. Okay, you may recognize that. It's one of the major cities where the World Cup was just held, right? May King is relieved, and Johannesburg is captured. Okay, in June, Pretoria falls. Again, you'll probably recognize both of those. In November, Kitchener takes over to supervise the cleanup, right? The bulk of the fighting is over, but what happens at this point?
Concentration.
Right. The concentration camps are brought in, thank you, in response to the guerrilla warfare. So in 1901, a bitter guerrilla war and clearance of Dutch civilian population. In 1902 is the peace at Verniering.
Exams so much harder than going to the
You don't need to remember all the cities necessarily. I mean, Kimberley, Ladysmith, and Lady King. That's not so bad, hopefully. Okay? You don't need to remember this. Okay. Very quick background to the war. Some of it you'll remember, some of it you won't. We didn't talk a lot of detail about some of it, but South Africa was originally settled by the Portuguese. Okay, the Portuguese very, very early on kind of ruled the seas and navigation. Okay, in large part, thank you, due to the development of navigational tools. Okay, like the compass and so on. But that's later taken over by the Dutch as part of the Dutch East India Company, a massive company that traded tea, primarily tea, and other goods from India. Well, it's nice to have control of the Cape because it's a halfway point to stop over when you're coming from India back up the coast to Holland. So, the mid-1600s, settlers followed and they established farms all over South Africa. But a little bit later on, in the early 19th century, during the Napoleonic Wars, the British take it over. Okay? And they see it as a strategic point to control the growing British Empire. Okay? And to fight the war, which is why they keep it. It's confirmed a British possession in 1814 and 15. The Dutch settlers, though, remained. Okay? You can't blame them. They're perfectly happy to remain for the time being. They didn't like the British, but, it's where they lived, so they didn't move. But in 1834, the British changed the game by outlawing slavery. And the Dutch really didn't like that, so they decided to move. But rather than move back home, they just moved north of the British territory. Does that make sense? Okay, so they just pushed their way further north, so they didn't have to live under the British. They eventually established two states, right? The Transvaal and the Orange Free State, okay? Just north of the British Cape Colony, which is the very tip of South Africa. Then we have the Zulu Wars that break out, okay? The only real ongoing conflict that these Dutch settlers had was with the Zulus, okay? Because the Zulus were actually a particularly powerful native tribe, and they were pretty good at warfare, and so they were continually giving the Dutch a problem. The first Boer War, Gladstone felt it wasn't worth it, right? And we've already said that in the first Boer War, Gladstone just kind of gave up. Okay? Now, I'm not going to go through these in any detail because, again, you really don't need to know them. You just need to know that the Boers were happy to take British control when the British helped them with the Zulus. As soon as that was over, the Boers wanted their independence back. Make sense? Gold is discovered in 1886. British settlers moved north, and they search for gold on their own or they work in the mines, okay, for a number of different reasons. so they move into those areas. Why go to war? There are a couple of debates of that, right? We've got the, well, was it gold or not gold? Okay? This is an excerpt from a memorandum written by Joseph Chamberlain. Okay? And it says, well, what is now at stake is the position of Great Britain in South Africa, and with it, the estimate formed of our power and influence over our colonies throughout the world. So if we cannot maintain control in South Africa, the rest of our colonies are going to think that they can push us around. Does that make sense? The Dutch desire, if it be possible, to get rid of the connection with Great Britain, which to them is not the motherland, and substitute a sort of United States of South Africa, which they hope would be mainly under Dutch influence. I think the time has fully come when the troops of South Africa should be largely reinforced. This is sent in 1899, before the war breaks out. He can see it coming, but there's kind of an excuse here. Now, do you get the impression that this has anything to do with gold in Chamberlain's excerpt? No. Okay. This is the other argument here. Is it really about gold, or is it about maintaining a strategic position in South Africa, which is important for trade, and since the United Kingdom still had lots of colonies in Asia, including India itself, which is more important, okay? Having it as a strategic point to get to India and maintain control in India and, further east, or is it just the hunt for gold? So that's our key question. The discovering Transvaal led to the war in sort of two ways, and there are two ways we can look at it. The first way is it gave the government an excuse to go to war to protect the Uitlanders and made fighting the war more worthwhile. We can't argue that now, the Transvaal is worth something. So gaining control over it is important. But because there were so many British citizens in the area, that gives you the perfect excuse to go to war, because really it's in defense of these British citizens whose rights are being infringed upon. Does that make it really easy to make a publicity campaign to go to war and get people on your side, right? Your British brethren are being mistreated. Let's go to war and save them. Yeah. Okay. The reality is that wherever the gold came from, wherever in the world gold came from, London was the capital of global trade. It pretty much all went through London anyway. Does that make sense to you? So even if it came from an area not occupied by the British, it still went through London, which means that the British were still making money off it. London was the trade capital of the world.
In general.
Yeah. London was what New York City now is. Okay, in terms of, all the major stock and the world's wealth was traded through London. Okay, or the vast majority of it. New York was growing at the time, but it was nowhere near what London was. Okay, the greater issue was really that the Transvaal suddenly got rich. And when they suddenly get rich, they do a couple of things. Mainly, they start to build up a sort of military, something that we would recognize as a military. They go to Germany and they buy their best weapons. Okay? They bought the Mauser rifles from Germany and sought German diplomatic protection. Okay? If you are having disagreements with England at this time, the turn of the century, the best place to go is the second most powerful nation in Europe, and that's Germany. Okay? And at this point, in 1899, Germany is just about to start outproducing England in all major war goods, including rifles and large guns. Okay?
England always hated Germany.
There's always been this kind of weird disagreement. Bear in mind, Germany is, at this point is only 28 years old. Germany only becomes a country in 1871. But yeah, to a large extent, I'd say there's always been this kind of feeling of animosity towards Germany. And part of that is because the ruler of Germany is Kaiser Wilhelm II, okay, who is Queen Victoria's grandson. Okay, they're all related, remember. And so even though he feels a certain kinship to England in that way, he very much feels a sense of wanting to be better than Great Britain. So he tries to build a navy that's larger than Great Britain's. Obviously, Great Britain doesn't really like that very much, and so they respond. And so there's this big naval race going on as well. Many felt that the power and growing influence of the Transvaal and Orange Free State threatened the British Cape, which was seen as vital for the rest of the empire. Does that make sense? Right? You've got this British Cape, which is a very small area in a way, but it is really strategically important. And you have a Dutch state which doesn't really like you, that's just got rich and significantly more powerful in the course of about 10 years. Okay? Are you going to feel threatened by them? Yeah, I can see that. Does the excuse of, the fact that they're mistreating English citizens give you an excuse to take care of that threat? Yeah. The structure of the army, okay, one of our key questions is, how was the structure of the army changing over time through the three wars? Well, we know what it was like in the Crimean War. To become an officer, you kind of had to be rich and know somebody, yeah? Now, there were these Cardwell reforms after the Crimean War that we talked about that said, an officer's position should be based on merit. Well, the problem is, when you were an officer, it was an unpaid position. Well, if you were going to be an officer and not get paid any money from it, were you going to be able to be from a working class family? No. Because there's no income. You wouldn't be able to buy your food or the equipment you needed. You had to pay for some of your equipment on your own. So it was still the upper class. The army itself was slightly larger, okay, but it was still much smaller than the conscript armies of Europe. What's conscription? What's the conscript army?
What they say, go on.
You've got to join. In Germany, required service was 5 years at this point. You were required to serve in the army for 5 years, every male. Say it again? There was no conscription at all. It was voluntary. Yeah. So clearly the army is going to be much, much smaller in England, where, you can go if you want to, than it is in Germany, where every male has to serve. The Cardwell reforms had made the army more efficient. Okay, one of the big things about the Cardwell reforms is that, do you remember in the Crimean War when we listed all the institutions that were involved in supplies and all the different organizations and bureaucratic systems that were in place? That 15 different people were somehow involved in the ordering of one thing, which really slows the process down. Well, the Cardwell reforms got rid of those, right, and created one kind of parent organization. Man for man, the British Army was more expensive than any of the other continental armies, any other armies in Europe. On paper, the British Army was about 250,000. Okay, Germany at this point could put 1 million men on the field. Okay, the British Army was only 1/4 of that, and controlled about 1/5 of the world's land. There were 78,000 regular reservists, but if we do the math, if we break that down, there were 60 to 70,000 stationed in India, right? India is a massive country, and it's a British colony, so you need lots of troops to maintain that. 60,000 were stationed kind of everywhere else around the globe. There were other reservists, right? There were 65,000 militia here in Britain. Okay, only half of those, a little more than half of those were available for overseas service. And there were 230,000 very poorly trained but very enthusiastic volunteers as well. Okay, but they couldn't be sent abroad. There were also 10,000 yeomanry, but they were only for internal security. So any of these really gonna get involved in the Boer War? Just these, right? Just those 35,000. So when we think about it, the British Army isn't that big, okay? And quite significant numbers are committed already elsewhere. So to now send reserves to South Africa is going to be a slow process, because what do you have to do? You can't send troops you've already got. What do you have to do instead? Yeah, get more volunteers, train them quickly, and send them down. Which means the Boer War is likely going to be the first fighting they see. We've already talked about the British Tommy. Okay, regular armies organized into closely bonded regiments. Okay, one would serve abroad and the other would stay at home. Soldiers were still predominantly the poor. How was the British soldier treated back at home? Really harshly, yeah. Can we think of some examples of things we talked about?
I don't know if you talked about it, but I read that.
We certainly did talk about it, yeah. And it's in one of the documents. They were throwing out pubs off buses, things like that. They weren't highly regarded. Why? Because they were the poorest people in society. And so they weren't treated particularly well. There's even that one cartoon we looked at where it's the soldier being kind of catered to because we're at war, and then, we're not at war and everybody's mean to him.
But generally now, the army's still poor people, so why has it actually changed towards them?
I think there just tends to be, I think
Just
class,
because they're doing more
that's certainly part of it, but I think class is also less important. We don't judge people on class quite as much as we used to. I think classism in this country, any of you ever watch, is it Mock the Week?
Yeah.
I got news for you with Reginald D. Hunter. The black guy with a really deep voice. He's awesome. But in one of his stand-ups, he talks about how, for the British, classism is like racism, okay? That the British treat class like Americans do races. And that certainly used to be true. There were many volunteers from Ireland and Scotland. Many of them were the urban unemployed. Lots of them really unhealthy. Can anyone spit back a statistic to me? I probably said to you 100,000 times. Cities like Manchester, what were some of the issues with volunteers? Unfit. Anybody remember how many were unfit? 90%. 9 out of 10 people who volunteered were unfit. They're the urban unemployed. They're not eating well. They're living in a city that is incredibly highly polluted. Okay? Indoor plumbing is still not so much. Okay? And most factories use what? Coal. What do we know about how coal burns? Yeah, it burns black. Okay? So London would have been foggy all the time. Okay? Even now, London is very, very dirty. At this time, it was obscenely dirty. Okay? The birch trees literally turned black. And in cities like Manchester, that wasn't going to be very different. Okay? So they're unhealthy. They can barely breathe. They're not eating well because they're unemployed. Soldiers here in the UK had a really low social standing, right? They were paid only a shilling a day, and many were excluded from all kinds of social events, right? Kept out of theaters and things like that. The treatment of soldiers in the army was in fact much, much better, right? The food allowance is what attracted many. We've talked about this before. They got 3/4 of a pound of meat per day, okay? A pound of bread, and a gill of rum was introduced. I still don't know exactly how much a gill is. I think you asked me that the last time. I never looked it up. It's not a lot. I think it's like a double shot or something close to that. It's not, a bottle of rum.
Until they said a full
Are you Googling it? Can you come back to this when you find it? Okay. Discipline, flogging in wartime had been banned since the Crimean War, right? So in the Crimean War, even during the war, soldiers would be physically punished and flogged. What is flogging?
Oh, a gill is equal to 4 ounces.
What? Okay, it's 4 ounces, so it's about half a cup. It's not a lot. 4 ounces would probably be about a double shot. Okay, maybe a triple. It's not much. Okay, flogging and wartime ban in 1881. We finally realized maybe it's not good to injure our own soldiers. Okay, is certainly part of it. But when we think about treatment of soldiers, it's a little bit more regard to how they should be treated in general. It did continue in military prisons until 1907. That's not particularly important. I got it here, but it's not really important for you to know that. Okay? Initiative was discouraged. Okay? Soldiers were not regarded to have a high enough standing to have any say in how fighting happened. Okay? Theirs was but to do and die. Do you remember that from the charge of the Light Brigade? Okay? Well, that part hadn't changed. The soldier's job was just to follow orders blindly. Just do what you're told. Shut up about anything else. Do what you're told. Okay? And that really was how they were regarded. Okay? Supplies. Some of these had changed. In 1899, the khaki uniform was introduced just in time. What were they wearing before that? Yeah, the red with white, the white bullseye. Thank you very much. Yeah, they still did have issues here because they still had bright buttons which reflected the sun in South Africa. They adopted the Lee Enfield magazine rifle, so this is better, right? They have a gun they can shoot repeatedly. The magazine would have held about, I think, 14, okay, 10 or 14 bullets. So that's certainly better than the front-loading rifle they were using in the Crimean War. Okay. Problem is, many of the sights were defective. A lot of soldiers had to adjust the sights and rebuild them on site. There was creation of the Army Corps, which improved supply lines. Okay. You have kind of one organization responsible for all of those supplies. The Royal Army Medical Service was created in 1898. Well, here we are in 1899. What's going to be the problem with the Royal Army Medical Service? Great idea, but it's still going to be quite new. So there are still going to be issues that we'll talk about in more detail on Thursday, but there are clearly going to be issues. Okay? As I said, there's no more purchase of commissions, right? You don't buy your way into becoming an officer. You have to pass the civil service exam, right? You have to take a test. But the private income was still necessary, which excluded the working class. And even though you had to take a test, well, guess what? I mean, people in the upper classes are going to be more literate, more likely to actually be able to study and pass that test to half the time. Okay? Again, you don't need to know these numbers, but even at the low levels, officers needed 100 to 150 pounds per year to be able to pay for equipment and survive. Okay? That's far more than any working class family is going to be able to provide. Okay? Higher level, like cavalry, you needed 600 to 1,000 per year because you had to buy your saddle and care for the horse and all that. There wasn't really a lot of interest in what it meant to be a good officer. Okay? They didn't study. They didn't discuss tactics. Okay? They didn't continually train and retrain about how new technology would impact the battlefield. Okay? None of that happened. Okay? We'll talk about what impact that had. They mostly filled in forms and pursued sport. What sport do you think they probably pursued? Well done. Yeah, probably fox hunting or pheasant hunting. Okay? That was the bulk of their time and energy. Okay? Size of the Boer Army. The Boer Army had 54,000 regular men. Now the key issue here is in total, and I'll have this number come up in a little while, but in total, the British Army was 485,000. The Boer Army was 55,000. The British Army, in the end, was almost 10 times that. Okay. The Boer Army, they had no regular drill. Each had a Mauser rifle And they were really good shots. Do you remember some of the stories we talked about? Their ability to shoot. Okay? They could shoot accurately while riding on horseback. Why? Say again? Plenty of training. What was their training, really? Yeah, it was farming and hunting. You had to be that good of a shot to hunt on the veldt. It's an open plain. Okay, the biggest game you're going to see is probably a large rabbit. Okay, and rabbits are fast, they're cunning, okay, and they'll hear you from a mile off, so you've got to be good. Oh wait, let me finish that. They relied on, they had these hardy little ponies for transport, but again, just about every one of them would have had one of those ponies, and that's an issue for the English. Each man felt entitled to have a say in strategy and tactics. Officers were not appointed, they weren't just the rich, they were elected within the local commandos. Local commandos are kind of district regiments. There were about 200 to 1,000 soldiers in them. And those soldiers elected the person they wanted to be their officer. Do you think it was going to be a popularity contest? No. Okay? They were going to elect somebody they trusted and thought knew what they were doing, right? They were well equipped with the latest German weapons, and spent almost 9 times what the British did for their entire empire on intelligence gathering. Okay? So for the entire empire, the British spent about 11,000 for intelligence gathering, 11,000 pounds. The Boers spent 90,000 per year just gathering intelligence on the English. Okay? The British Army in South Africa, at the time the war was declared, there were under 15,000 men in South Africa. Okay? So there were 14,750 men, British soldiers in South Africa when war was declared, giving the Boers serious advantage. Okay? And they did well to take advantage of that. Okay? Reinforcements from India were on their way. Which would bring the total to about 22,000, still far less than the Boers had. By December 1st, though, of 1899, Redvers Buller commanded 84,000 troops. The problem with that is that only 58,000, well, yeah, not only. The problem is that 58,000 were regular infantry, which means that there was a real shortage in cavalry and horses, making transportation really difficult. Okay? If you've got to walk across the veldt, it makes it pretty clear you're coming. Okay? You can't move quickly. So movement was a real issue, and commandos were always short on cavalry and horses. Okay? That's through a bulk of the war. And you'll see that too in the map. These dark lines here are the major railways. Which cities did the Boer take control of right at the beginning of the war? Here's Kimberley. Ladysmith is actually, where are we, right here? Okay, and what was the third one? Mayking, which is up here. Okay, actually I think Mayking is closer to here, but you get the idea. There are 4 major railways that run from the Cape up north. And the discovery of gold leads to the construction and extension of these railways, right? You've got to transport all that gold down to some key ports, right? We've got East London, Port Elizabeth, and Cape Town are your key ports. So the gold is loaded on the railway and taken south. Well, the most efficient way for the British to transport troops and supplies is going to be these railways, right? So why do you think Kimberley, Ladysmith, and Mayking were targeted? Yeah, okay, you got it, okay. they're all close to the Boer land, right? But more importantly, they're all major railway stops. Okay? Kimberley's a major city that cuts off this railway from the north. You take this junction, which is Ladysmith, you've cut off this whole railway, so there are two down. Okay? King just hits that one further to the north. So the only railway that's not directly taken and still has access is this one here that comes to the north and right through. Because this one's cut off, as is this one. Okay? We can still get here to Victoria. Okay? So those are the four railways. The capture of those three cities is important. So the Boers strike first. They siege King, Kimberley, and Ladysmith. And there are three different stories here, right? George White gets himself cut off with 10,000 troops in Ladysmith. Okay? So there are only 14,000 troops at the time war is declared. 10,000 of them managed to get themselves cut off in the city of Ladysmith. Okay? Kimberley, Cecil Rhodes, and the British troops that were there are cut off. And King managed, with a very small force, they managed to hold out until 1900, okay, until early spring 1900. The Boers failed to push further south into British territory. Okay, they take these three areas just outside of their borders, but they never push down. Okay, why does Kruger decide not to push further south?
Otherwise, they keep fighting. Right now, it's probably got the same values as the last one, so it's probably going to back off again.
Yeah. Okay. He's hoping that the British are going to respond the same way they did in the First World War. It's not worth it. Okay? This will be a much tougher fight than we might expect, so we'll back off. That's what Kruger's hoping for. He underestimates the British this time, though, and the value of the area. So he hoped that 3 quick victories would be enough, just like it was in the First World War. Okay? The British strategy is one of the major issues early on. Now, obviously, this is a quote, an excerpt from a primary source document, so we don't need to write it down. But frontal attacks in broad daylight were the recognized method of approaching the enemy. They still use that tactic. Okay? We'll just come head on at you, and we'll hopefully just fire enough shot at you that will get you. Okay? Which was great when the most accurate weapon was a ball shot musket, or it's even really before rifling happened. Do you understand what rifling is? What does rifling do? Yeah, absolutely. Can you explain it in more detail? Yeah. Okay. There's a small groove in the barrel. Okay, almost like a screw. And what it does is it puts just enough spin on the bullet that it makes the bullet far more accurate. By putting that spin on the bullet, you make it travel further, more accurately. Say it again? It's exactly why you put spin on a rugby ball, yeah. The example works better for an American football, but yes, it's exactly why. When you put spin on the ball, it's more accurate. Yeah, but you don't, in American football, you throw like this, you get a lot of spin on it, and you throw it.
You're not throwing
You gotta learn how to do it. Putting spin on it makes a big difference. So now, with accurate shot, while the British are coming forward in broad daylight in 2 huge lines, what are the Boers doing? Clink, 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 clink. Okay? So, it really did not seem to have dawned on the old-fashioned military mind that a complete revolution had been made in the whole science of war, strategically as well as tactically. Not only by the invention of the quick-firing gun, but above and beyond all, by the discovery of smokeless powder. Why smokeless powder? Why is that important? Exactly. You can't see where the shot's coming from. All you see is that the guy next to you is now dead. Okay? You don't know where the shot came from. And in that kind of chaos, you can hear it, but shots are being fired everywhere, so you can't directionalize that sound, okay, where the shot that killed the guy next to you came from. So it means that people can shoot at you and still remain in hiding, okay, which clearly had made more difference than all the other inventions put together. All doctrines of superiority of fire vanished when the enemy could fire on you and still remain invisible. It became possible for 10 men properly concealed to withstand effectively 100 or more. Indeed, with my own eyes, I saw this happen over and over again, both in South Africa and the World War. In the former war, the tragic failures of Graspan, Magersfontein, the Modder River, which is just outside of Kimberley, and on the Natal side, on the Tugela, were striking instances of this obvious truth. Right? Black Week is when Buller tries to lead his now army of 88,000 British soldiers. He splits them into 3 groups, and he tries to go up and lead those 3 cities. Okay, so under Lord Methuen, the first group goes up the Western Railway to relieve Kimberley. They launch the attack on Kimberley, this attempt to relieve Kimberley on the 11th. The attack again happens in broad daylight. Okay, the Boers managed to pin down over 400 of the Highlanders for 10 hours. Okay, where they can't even get up, get water, and meanwhile they're attacked by fire ants. What do we know about the Highlanders and what they're wearing? They're wearing kilts. Not the kind of gear you want to have on when you're attacked by fire ants. Just kind of try to imagine that, laying in the hot sun. Not comfortable. Okay, fire ant bite stings a little bit less than a bee sting. Yeah. Okay, they're stuck out in the hot sun, lying in the sand, in the dirt, and the primary source document in the textbook talks about how anytime someone got up to move, they were just shot. Okay, so they were pinned down until dark, pretty much. Okay.
Why didn't just get whole 8,000 like first go to Kimberley and then to anything
That's a good question. Try to relieve all of them at the same time. There's some strategy in that too. But yeah, I mean, think about moving those numbers all the way around there would have been difficult, really difficult. Gallagher is in the second group. Okay, his job is to protect the north of the Cape Province and the other 2 rail lines. He decides on his own to try to relieve Ladysmith as well. He walks straight into a Boer force holding the railway junction, suffers 135 casualties, and 561 are taken prisoner. Okay, so he doesn't do very well either. And Buller's defeat in his attempt to relieve Mayking is similar. Okay? Queen Victoria's response. Okay, please understand that there is no one depressed in this house. We are not interested in the possibility of defeat. It does not exist. If you're Buller and you get this telegram from Queen Victoria that says we are not interested in the idea of defeat, does that put a little pressure on you? A little bit, right? Okay. We're not interested in the possibility of defeat. It does not exist. So she pushes for massive reinforcements. She also sends down Lord Roberts and Lord Kitchener, who had been very successful in the north of Africa. Okay, Kitchener in Cairo, yeah. Okay, they come down to take over command. Before they get there, though, Buller suffers another defeat at Spion-Camp. Now, the tactics, nobody argues really that the tactics used early in the war by the British were awful. Okay, what we do have to kind of, the caveat to that is Buller does learn from his mistakes and he gets better. Okay. British success in 1900, more forces were arriving, including 30,000 from across the empire. Many were mounted infantry, so they could move faster. Large numbers volunteered at home. Eventually, just shy of 450,000 soldiers were transported halfway around the globe to fight the Boer War. Okay? Bear in mind, what's the size of the Boer army? Does anybody remember? Yeah. Okay. 54,000. Roberts reached the Modder River in February, quickly outmaneuvers the Boers, and released Kimberley by the 15th. Buller redeems himself on the 28th of February when he relieves Ladysmith. Okay, he did learn and adapt quickly to the new tactics. He did suffer a couple of defeats first, but then he gets really good at outmaneuvering the Boers and manages to move into Boer territory after he relieves Ladysmith. Okay, Robert suffered supply issues in Bloemfontein, and by the time he gets there, okay, after he relieves Kimberley, he moves into Boer territory and goes into Bloemfontein. Suffers some serious supply issues because he's relying on just one railway line. If we go back to one without the title. There. He relieves Kimberley, comes into Bloemfontein, but this is the only railway line he can rely on. Okay? So he suffers supply issues as a result of that. You're trying to supply what is now a fairly large army. You've only got access to one railway line, so that hurts him. As a result, a lot of his troops died from things like typhoid. In fact, more than died in any of the fighting. Kitchener took over in 1900, in November 1900 for cleanup duty. Okay. Before that, he was the kind of assistant commander-in-chief, right? He was the right-hand man, if you will. He adopts a slash and burn policy when the Boers go underground, and he establishes the concentration camps. Peace comes May 31st, 1902. The Transvaal Republic and the Orange Free State become part of the British Empire. They're now part of South Africa. Amnesty for those who fought in the war, so they're not criminals. Yeah, it's right at the end of the war. I'm not sure whether it's a 1 or 2.
This page too much.
The British give the Boers a grant of £3 million to pay for the damage caused by the slash and burn policy. Think that's enough? Not really, but it's something. The prospect of future self-government is held out, but there's no date attached to it. It's sort of like the Brown versus Board of Education decision, right? With all due speed, right? It's kind of alluded to, but there's no date attached to it, so it doesn't really mean anything. The cost to the British, £201 million. To defeat an army of 54,000, it cost the British £201 million. Now think about how much money that is in 1900. Okay. Yeah, seriously. That'd be a nice lot of money now. But in 1900, that's an obscene amount of money. Casualties, the British suffer just under 6,000 in battle, and just over 16,000 in disease and wounds. I'm sure you can figure out that means. Okay? Now that's the whole run through the Boer War. Very, very quickly. I know it's kind of tedious and boring to just talk at you for the almost hour that it took.